Hey, it's Brett, and thank you for joining me on this episode of Behind the Stack, where today I am sitting down with author Luis Jaramillo for his new book, The Witches of El Paso. A little bit about Luis. He is the author of The Doctor's Wife, which was the winner of the Dzanc Books Short Story Collection Contest. It was an Oprah Book of the Week and one of NPR's Best Books of 2012. Luis's fiction and nonfiction has appeared in Tin House, Lit Hub, Poets and Writers Magazine, and Bomb Magazine, among other publications. He's an assistant professor of creative writing at the New School. He received an undergraduate degree from Stanford and an MFA from the New School. So enjoy this episode, and as always, thanks for being here. So thank you so much for being here. It's so lovely to meet you. I absolutely loved your book. I thought it was just so fantastic and so surprising. I didn't know what to expect, and I just thought it was really wonderful.
Thank you.
So I'm thrilled that you're here. Before we dive into the book itself, and also just for the people who are watching this, I just think this cover is just so beautiful. Just a little bit about you. You are the assistant professor of writing at the New School, and you grew up in Salinas, California. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Now, did you have brothers and sisters?
I have one brother who I just saw yesterday. He lives in Pittsburgh now.
That's where I'm from.
Oh, really?
Where in Pittsburgh?
He lives in Squirrel Hill.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd never been to Pittsburgh before my brother moved there, and it's charming. It's like I don't know, great art stuff, and that park that the universities are around is really great too.
Yeah, it's a great city. It was a great city to grow up in, and I was also very happy to leave it. But were you a reader growing up?
I was a huge reader. I went to the library. I went to the bookstore. My parents always bought me whatever book I wanted. You know, I couldn't have anything I wanted in the rest of my life, but they bought me any book I wanted. When I went to a bookstore, I would always get a stack of books and just tear through them, which, you know, in some ways was good. I mean, yay reading, but it also just sort of taught me to read really quickly, which has served me well as a teacher and as, you know, doing things like this with other people, you know, having to read their stuff and then quickly be able to synthesize some responses and questions. But I have terrible retention. So it's, you know, I can like hold everything for a short amount of time and then it gets kicked out of my brain. I don't know about you, but I very rarely remember plot. I remember some images, I remember some scenes, or characters, of course. But it's sort of an impression of the book that I remember rather than the this happened and then this happened and then this happened.
Yeah, or do you find, I also find if I have an emotional response to the book at parts, that will be something that resonates with me more. Or I remember when I could remember where I was when I was reading that particular book or that particular passage based on if I had a strong visceral reaction to something.
Absolutely.
But so that's kind of an interesting thing. Now, okay, so you went and did your undergrad at Stanford, but you didn't start out as a writer, correct?
I mean, I took writing classes my last year in college. And actually, I took classes with Lan Samantha Chang. My very first writing class was with Lan Samantha Chang, who now runs the Iowa program.
Okay.
He's a great writer, you know, short story writer and novelist. And I was like, oh, this is something that I really want to do. You know, because I loved reading so much, I always sort of assumed that I would be a writer. But, you know, wanting to be a writer and being a writer are two different things. Mm-hmm. And it's much harder to actually sit down and try to produce something and see the broken thing that emerges in the first, you know, 20 drafts or whatever. Lan was just a great teacher, and I had some other really great teachers at Stanford. And then it took me a while I took sort of 2 years between college and graduate school. And then even in graduate school was not a great, I was very undisciplined.
Interesting.
I was busy doing other things. I had just moved to New York, and I had that's what I was focused on.
You had life. It was life.
I was 24 years old.
You had distractions. I was watching a video of you from the New School, and it was from 2015, and you said you were writing a novel. Was that this novel?
Yes.
Okay. So what you said was, you were talking about the about practice, and you were talking about also just what we were just speaking about the dedication to writing and writing every day. And you said practice, though necessary every time, is only the road that takes you to the edge of the cliff. And you said, I'm standing at the edge of the cliff right now as I'm writing this book. Well, now you're on the other side. So how do you feel? You're
I can't even remember where I said that or why, but I do agree with that. The jumping off the edge is necessary, and then I was to keep up the metaphor, in the air for a long time, just sort of flailing and trying to figure this thing out. And now here I am. I have actual physical copies of the real book now,
yeah,
and it feels exciting, but at the same time, part of me is like, oh, what's the next thing?
right.
Which is not to diminish this moment, and it's fun to see the book get out there. The book being out there means that people are responding to it, and people who I don't know, which is exciting and scary and sometimes not great. But then other times it's just the way that the things that people connect to are things that I worked on in private, and it's a very interesting experience to see that happen and to sort of feel that inner world um, become real.
Yeah, and that you've sat with for so long, and these characters that you've sat with for so long.
Yeah.
It's wild. So for our listeners and viewers who don't know, can you give us a little elevator pitch on the book?
Sure. I'm so good at elevator pitches. I'm actually good at them for other people. So what I've been thinking about for this book is that this is a story about two people who want to get out of their regular lives for a couple of reasons. One of the characters, and this storyline is set in World War II era El Paso, is an 18-year-old, and she has to take care of her sister's kids and is just really has very limited options in life. And so she calls out to be taken away, and she is. In fairy tales, you to get what you ask for is the start of the story and sort of like the where things start to go wrong. The other character, main character, and this is set in contemporary times, is a lawyer for poor people. She's married, she has kids, and she's facing down middle age, and so for other reasons, she's asking to be taken out of her life. And the way that she's taken out of her day-to-day life is by her great aunt, who's the other character now in her 90s, calls her to her house and says that she's just seen her daughter, who she left many years ago in another time. So this is all. This is the start of the story. Is the skeptical lawyer is drawn into the world of her great aunt, who is able to see the future and talk to the dead.
Yeah, Marta, who is the lawyer, I think is such a great character. It's such an interesting character because you've kind of created both sides of the Scully and Mulder X-Files character, where she's a lawyer, so she deals in facts, and suddenly faced with this, supernatural angle, and also probably wondering if her aunt isn't a little bit crazy. I love that this book is so, first of all, I love that it's about these strong women, but it's also so steeped in kind of history and folklore and superstition. Where did this all come from? Where did you get this idea? And that's why I wanted to know. I wanted to know if you had sisters, really. So it's interesting that you have a brother.
No, so many times I've written about a sister. I don't know where that sister is, but she's sort of haunting my stories and life. An older sister. I'm an older sibling, but there's an older sister around there somewhere in my head.
Interesting.
Yeah. But the stories came from, some of them are drawn from family stories. And I wanted to, my family's from El Paso. I lived in El Paso for when I was a little kid, and then visited throughout my childhood and later. But my dad's family is from El Paso for a very long time, hundreds of years, or sort of El Paso and New Mexico. And so a lot of the stories are just stories that have been handed down. So some folklore, some family stories. And then I did a ton of research too, because I felt like I needed to really educate myself on the history of El Paso and Juarez and, colonial Mexico and lots of other things that didn't make it into the book. But if you're from a place or sort of near a place and you've never studied it before, it's really interesting to dig in and find actual facts about what happened, and think about how the way things are have a reason, a historical reason. One thing that I've been thinking about recently is just the scale of things is feels very different than other places in the country. This is in the book, but El Paso is right next to Fort Bliss, which is, I think, the biggest army base in the country. But if not, it's huge. It's the size of Rhode Island.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then so it stretches from El Paso then up into New Mexico, where it touches White Sands Missile Range, which is twice the size of Rhode Island. So there's this enormous piece of land, in New Mexico and in Texas, that, if you sort of like mapped on eastern United States onto it, it's like it's a lot of land, and there's kind of nothing going on there. So there's that sense of isolation in El Paso because of that, just because it's surrounded by vast deserts and mountains where people just don't live, which is not how I grew up and not where I live now, certainly.
And it's also a very mixed community, right? I mean, culturally and all of it.
Yeah, I would say the term is bicultural. It's like really, I don't know exactly what the percentage is of Latinas versus white people in El Paso, but that's basically the makeup. Sort of taking out Fort Bliss, which is of course very diverse because it's an army base. But people speak Spanish. Even white people speak Spanish. Everyone speaks Spanish because you kind of have to.
Yeah, it's a border town, so you're talking about immigration as well, which comes into it.
Yeah. So immigration, and so one thing that I find so fascinating about El Paso is that lots of immigrants do come through the port, and there are immigration courts, and there are people who sort of come through and then ask for asylum and then have to be, and so the ICE sort of deals with them, and then there are nonprofits that feed and house them, and then usually they move elsewhere in the United States. There's also this very stable population of people who live either in Juarez or in El Paso, and they cross back and forth almost daily.
Oh, wow.
People cross for school, for work, for entertainment, for to get dinner. It's really easy to cross, and even people who are Mexican citizens can get, I can't remember what it's called, but there's some special kind of pass that allows them to sort of cross back and forth, because it needs to be open so that trade can happen, for one thing. There are these cities that are, I describe this in the book, but when you can walk from downtown El Paso to downtown Juarez, you just cross this pretty small little bridge, and there you are in another country, and it feels like you're in another country.
Wow. I don't know if you've discovered this in terms of your research, but how much has that changed? Certainly at like post 9/11 or whatever, how is that locked down? I mean, there has to be.
Yeah, it's changed a lot to come into the United States. So when I was a kid, I don't quite remember this, but I've been told that, when we would come back, after going to lunch at the market or something, you would just say American citizen, and then they would wave you through. So that has changed.
Board of directors.
Yeah. And actually, when I went recently, I was coming back, and I made the mistake of saying, so the ICE agent asked me what I'd been doing in Juarez, and I made the mistake of saying, "Oh, researching a book." And so then he got like really serious, and he was like, "What does it have to do with trafficking?" It was like, and I got like all these questions. And I was like, God, next time just say,
went for lunch.
I went for lunch. Yeah.
I would have loved it. Did you say, no, it's about witches?
I don't know what I said, but I was like, note to self, do not.
Right.
Don't claim to be a writer ever. It never works out.
Right. One more way that writers are maligned all the time. So this character of Nanna, I also find her completely fascinating. And what I love about her is you really get to see her at 2 points in her life. You get to see her as this young woman, and then later in her dealings with Marta. She's called now. Now I'm gonna. I may mess up this pronunciation, so please correct me. Is it a guia?
Gia.
A guia. She's a guia. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, so in the book, I say that doesn't say that she's a witch, or, bruja, curandera, like a healer with herbs and that kind of thing. She's a guide, and she thinks of herself as somebody who is there to help people talk to people who've passed on. And those are so. At one point in the book, she has other kinds of magical powers, but at the end of her life, what she still has is this ability to talk to people who've died, or she thinks she does. I mean, it's something that I played around with a bit, like, what is it that she can do and what is it that she thinks she can do. But I think that she can see the other side.
Did you did you always know when you went into this, when you started this book, that you wanted this to be about, this magic element, or was that always there, or is it something that kind of developed as you went through, or how did that come up?
Yeah, good question. No, I had no intention of writing about magic. I mean, zero, like negative intention of writing about magic. I really wanted to write about El Paso and the border and family stories, but that's not a story. So it really wasn't until Nanna appeared as a character um, that I kind of knew what to do. So she appeared. I wrote some scenes with her. I recently went back to look at some of those scenes, and I was surprised. Like she comes in, and it's like she throws the door open. She goes over to the plate of cookies and scrapes the insides of Oreos out with her teeth, discards the cookie, and then reads someone's future in their teacup. And I was like, oh, right. She really just does kind of appears. And so but I was like, I'm not going to write about somebody who can read the future. That's not going to be the main thing. But I went to the Swanee Writers Conference as a fellow, and part of the deal was that one of the faculty members would look at a submission, or 15, 20 pages or something, and the writer Tony Early looked at my submission, and we sat down to talk, and he was like, well, this is a mess. But I was like, oh, really? But he's like, but Nanna, this character, this is where the story is. And I
Wow.
think that gave me the permission to go forward with her. So after Sawani, I was going to start writing Nanna's story, and I thought, okay, what I need to do is just really not try to do anything else but tell the story as it comes to me. And so I'd never done this before. I just hand wrote the whole first draft.
Wow. And it really was just a linear thing.
It was more linear
Linear-esque.
than not linear-esque, yeah. But it did prevent me from jumping around in time a bunch. I mean, there is time jumping around, and I was just telling Nanna's story in that draft. But yeah, it was pretty linear because I couldn't go back and change things, and I couldn't jump forward because it would disrupt the flow of what I was writing.
So, and then in other words, you almost just followed her story for a while, and then you kind of filled in.
Yeah, I mean, I did a whole draft. And that story is very different from what ended up happening, I think. But a lot of the elements remain.
And so, one of the things, and this is not a spoiler, is Nanna ends up at a convent. Can you talk a little bit just about convents at this time, and what it was like for women who were committing their life to this?
Yeah, so I had to do research about convents too. There never was a convent in Juarez, in colonial Mexico, because it was way too small. So in colonial Mexico, it was called El Paso del Norte, what
Hmm.
is now Juarez, which is south of the Rio Grande. The names have shifted, same place. It was too small, it was too provincial to support a convent. But I'm writing fiction, so I thought, well, I'll just make up a convent. That's fine. And the convents were. It depended on what the order was. There were different kinds of orders of nuns. Some of them were extraordinarily strict, so that the women who joined them, when they joined, they wouldn't leave until they died, and they couldn't
Wow.
ever see their families again. So it was really a very, almost like prison. People were, I'm sure, committed to religion, some of them, but who knows about others of them? And one reason I wanted to write about convents is because I was thinking about choices for women then and now, and during World War II times, and how things have changed and not. But in colonial Mexico, there really weren't very many options. It was, you get married, you go to the convent, or you're a servant. Kind of, those were kind of the choices.
They're all kind of the same thing.
They're all kind of. You are correct. But the convent stuff is it's interesting. Just like have you read Matrix, the Lauren Groff book?
Yes.
I really loved that book. I read it after I wrote mine, but I love any story that's set in a place that has these really defined boundaries and rules. Sure. The drama sort of starts to creep in because people are going to break rules.
And the hierarchy, which is fascinating.
And too. Hierarchy, right. So whatever hierarchy there is, it's going to be subverted in some way.
So your whole magic system, and when you came up with this, one of the elements being time travel. Talk about that for a little bit. And I'm curious, would you love that ability if you could have it?
Oof. I don't think so. I think time travel in the book complicates things, obviously. And so there's only really one instance in the book. There's kind of another thing that happens, but I didn't want it to be something that could happen a lot, because for one thing, it makes things way too complicated. And on the other hand, it also makes it too easy to fix things.
Sure.
And I wanted it to be an extraordinary thing that happened that can't be undone. So that's how that worked. But the rest of the magic, I'm in a writing group with the writer Alex Chi, and he read.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I love Alex.
I love Alex so much. Oh my God. And it's been this year for me. Like, I've literally going through his entire canon. I'm reading it with a group on Instagram, but oh my God. He's incredible.
Yeah, so I reread Edinburgh recently, and it's an extraordinary book.
Oh my God.
I also really loved the book about how to be an
how to write an autobiographical novel.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought that's the second one I read, which I thought was just extraordinary. And wow. So that's
I got
thrilling
to see some of those essays in while he was writing them. So that was like such a good lesson in that, even somebody like Alex Chi goes through more than one draft. And we know this, but it's also nice to see that happen. Anyhow, so he read an early draft of The Witches of El Paso and said, just sort of like thinking about magic, he was like, magic always complicates. And I think I put that phrase in the book. So magic is not something that solves any problem. It's something that maybe seems to solve one problem, but then leads to a bunch of other issues. So that was one thing that I was always thinking. And then just thinking about La Vista, which is what I call the magical force of the universe, I guess. That's magic, and things are complicated, but it's like, nature is complicated, and it's not just like, nature's not working toward perfection. Nature is working toward destruction and then creation again, and this endless cycle. So that's what I was trying to get at with the magic, that it's not good or bad force, but the cycle of creation and destruction.
Interesting. There was a line from the book that said, magical thinking is believing that what you imagine is manifested in the real world. Do you believe that? Do you believe in that yourself?
That you can manifest things in the real world?
Sure, yeah.
I do. And I think that anybody who writes fiction, or even nonfiction, but especially fiction, it's really weird when you write things and then the world changes. So, what are you changing? Is it just your perception and then the world seems to change? Who knows? But, if we change our perception, we do change our relationship with the world. And I've written other places about how, like, weird things happened in the writing of this book too. Like, there are ladybugs in the book because I live in New York, in Manhattan, right by the Lincoln Tunnel, on a pretty high floor. So there's no greenery to speak of. But for this whole kind of long stretch, I kept finding ladybugs on the windowsill next to the couch where I write. And or I'd find them like crawling inside the lampshade at night. And I just like, they were just, some of them were dead, some of them were alive. One morning I took a sip of my coffee and there was a ladybug in my mouth. Um,
Do you have a lot of plants?
no, no, I've killed all of them. So I don't know where they came from and anyhow, so when that was happening, I was like, okay, I got to put these in the book. There's something here. I guess that was sort of the world influencing the book, but I don't know. There's interesting things that kind of, I think part of it is just the way that you pay attention to the world changes dramatically once you're starting to write about something.
Interesting. Are you a spiritual person?
Yes. I'm not a religious person, but I am spiritual. I'm always looking for, what are we doing here? How do we live
Yeah.
here in a more peaceful way for ourselves and for others?
Yeah, I think there's a big separation between spirituality and religion. Absolutely. And I was someone who was raised like I was a WASP, and it was like very Presbyterian, but it was still very conservative. I went to church camp every year, and but I learned very quickly that there's a big difference between being religious and being spiritual. And but I asked that question because so much of it seems to bleed through. That's a kind of current that runs through this a lot. There's also, the book is very prevalent on themes of desire of all kinds, whether it's passion or family or even food, is such a part of this at times. But can you talk a little bit about this theme of desire?
Well, it's what makes us do things, anything. Yeah, sex, food, money, power. Those are the main things. But it's also what propels stories too. There's no story if there's no desire. And so some of the desires can stand in for other desires. So desire for power can maybe be, in some scenes, translated into a desire for food, for example. But also, I really love food, and I love to think about food, and I love to write about food. So, and one of the best senses is smell too, in writing, and just to be able to use smell in lots of different ways is effective and fun. But food really allows you to do that in a way that communicates something that you can't communicate in other ways.
Do you cook?
Yeah, I like to cook.
And are you more of a cook than a baker, or both?
Yes, I'm more of a cook than a baker. I baked bread for a while, like everyone else.
You had your starter during COVID.
I did.
What kind of stuff do you like to cook?
Well, I mean, I guess I don't like to follow a recipe. Sometimes I do. But I like to, go to a market, like especially a farmer's market, and see what there is and put it together in different ways. So sometimes it's more of like, oh, this is going to sound so silly, but like sometimes it's more Italian, sometimes it's more French, sometimes it's more Mexican, sometimes it's more Indian. But I have my little methods.
And are you a planner? Are you a weekly planner? Do you sit down with your husband and say, okay, let's map out what we're going to have this week? And do one of you cook more? Does he cook?
He cooks some. I do most of the cooking because I like to control things, and he would agree. But I like to cook, and no, I don't plan. It's constant going to the store almost every day, thinking
It's
like,
very European of you.
Well, we live in the city, so it's kind of possible.
Yeah, you have access like that. Yeah, I always say my mother-in-law stays with us periodically for, frankly, months. She comes for months at a time. She does that. She would always get up in the morning and decide what she wanted to do, and then would go to the market. And I always say it was so European because she'd come home and have whatever, and then she'd make it, which was fantastic. Don't get me wrong. This is another thing. Are you a salt person or a sweet person?
Definitely salt.
Interesting.
Yeah. So Nanna in the book is definitely a sweet person. She's sort of all about the sweets and that sort of like sensual pleasure.
Yeah, I'm a sweet person, 100%. Although I do enjoy I enjoy a great I enjoy a great meal. I enjoy salty foods, but if I have my druthers, I would pick a cake or a cookie or any
Are
of that
you a
anytime.
baker?
I am my husband is like you, where he can take ingredients and kind of throw stuff together and doesn't really need to follow a direction per se. I am very methodical and need to, know that it's a cup and a half of flour. I mean, for me, variation is like if I'm making a loaf, I'd be like, oh, let's try with the blueberries. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. But, and I love to bake. I just don't do it all the time because I love to eat it, but don't want to eat it, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
sure. Yeah.
I love this quote, and I would love to get your take on what this means to you. This is at a point in the book when Marta is trying to discover what Nanna, her great aunt, is hiding. And she says, family stories teach us how to live. Family secrets teach us to kill parts of ourselves.
Yeah, I was thinking about. Well, so I wrote a book of short stories, The Doctor's Wife, that I published, I don't know how many years ago, 12 years ago or something. And that idea was really central to that book. I was writing about it's fiction, or sort of fictionalized, again, family stories. But when my mother was very young, she was like 7, her younger brother died. He was not yet 3 years old. And he had this disease, congenital disease, that still doesn't have a cure. So I grew up knowing about this brother, this uncle who had died. And by the time I knew about it, he was younger than I was. So just like almost 3-year-old who had died was very fascinating to me. But nobody ever talked about him,
Mm.
or talked about what that was like. And I think that it really affected my mother and her aunt, and my aunt and my uncle, and their growing up and their ability to deal with some things. So maybe the thing that it taught them to kill was like they couldn't really think about. Well, they were all bad warriors. They were, sort of convinced to that they had to look on the dark side of things a lot of the time. But the flip side of that was that they also told all the family stories like they were jokes. So
Mm.
even like the sort of darker family stories. So the very first one that I wrote was that my uncle and grandfather were going. I wrote that they were fishing, but they were actually going hunting. Or they were hunting in Washington State somewhere, so way out in the woods. And my grandfather, who was a doctor, took a sip of his beer, and a bee stung him in the throat. And so they're very, very, very far away from everything else. And so my grandfather very calmly told my uncle, who was 12 years old, I think, how to give him an emergency tracheotomy. And then he ended up not having to do it. But that was one of the family stories that was told that was like, oh, isn't that funny? That time.
That time that we almost slit his throat open
Yeah.
because of the bee.
Yeah.
Oh, we look back in fondness at that time. So he had swallowed the bee, in other words,
The bee,
had gone
sure.
into the beer. He would have had the bee gone into the
Oh, the
beer, and he
bee
swallowed.
stung him inside his throat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh
So
my
he'd swallowed the bee.
God.
Yeah. And there were quite a few other stories like that. So yeah, I think the way that our families teach us to interact with the world is, there are some good things and some bad things. So family secrets aren't things that nobody knows. It's things that maybe people don't talk about, right? I mean, that's kind of what a family
Yeah.
secret is. Like, I know when I'm writing, when I feel like I'm telling the family secrets, I feel like that's when I've hit the gold mine, because I'm not holding anything back, and that's where the really good stuff is. But we're taught not to tell the family secrets. That's sort of like one of the main rules in families and in society. And what is that? What is it that we're trying to protect? And I think it varies by family, of course, but
It's
that
very much.
protection is really, I think, damaging.
Yeah, and it's also interesting too because of just saying you're protecting the family. and we're having a whole generation now of young people coming up who are very much living out in every kind of facet of their lives on social media, and everything is tell your secrets, tell your stories, tell all of these things almost on overkill. Like, you want to be like, hey, hold that back.
Well, true. That is the flip side.
But I think you're right. And I think, like, certainly, I know with my family, there were plenty of things, that were shut down, you didn't talk about. And, family was family, and you kept it within the confines of your home, and it wasn't anybody else's business to be that way. So, well, this was delightful. Good
Thank you
luck with
so
the
much.
launch. Go out, get The Witches of El Paso. It will be also on my bookshop.org page, which you can get it through there. If you get the audio, wherever you get your books, buy independent. And hopefully I will see you or talk to you soon.